This evening, let me welcome all of you for this evening meeting for the discussion on the future of US-India relationship. We have an excellent panel here. Right next to me is Ambassador Blackwell, probably the most popular American ambassador in India, and who started out the transformation of the US-India relationship a decade ago. After that, we have Ambassador Naresh Chandra, who probably served in every possible appointment as Secretary to the Government of India. He was the Cabinet Secretary, he was the Defense Secretary, he was the Home Secretary. Then he served as India's ambassador to the United States. Next to him, we have Richard Haas, who is the head of the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the premier think tank in the United States. Richard Haas had worked as the Director of Policy Planning under the first Bush administration when the US-India relationship began to evolve. And of course, we can trace back Richard Haas to his visit to India in 1990 at the time of the crisis between India and Pakistan, one of the first major military crises that we've had. He still remembers that as the Haas mission. I think there was also one Mr. Gates who came along with him to defuse the crisis at that point of time. So Haas goes back a long time dealing with India, and since then he's been engaged with India. And last but not the least, Mr. Jamshid Godrej, Chairman of the Godrej and Boyce Company. He's the President Emeritus of the Aspen Institute, which is the host organization tonight. He's also the Chairman Emeritus of the World Wildlife Fund and one of the leaders from the industry side on green issues and green technologies. What I thought I'll do is, as we look ahead to the future of the US-India relationship, I'll first turn to Bob Blackwell to tell us something about the meeting that we've been doing for the last few days, a new initiative from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Aspen Institute India to look at the future of the US-India relationship in terms of the basic national interests. And once Bob tells us that, then we'll go around the panel and look at the various aspects of the US-India relationship. As all of you know, this was not planned, that this meeting would take place just after Bin Laden has been taken out in Pakistan. But in many ways, the whole central question of Pakistan and Afghanistan, that has always been an important element of the US-India relationship, that has come to a very defining moment. We're also meeting at a time when China is rising, Chinese power. Everyone in the world has to deal with the reality of China's rising power. Therefore, how does that affect us? We also have a whole range of new issues that have come on the India-US template besides the old geopolitical stuff like China and Pakistan. The whole question of global warming, how should India adapt its positions, what can India do in terms of these multilateral issues. We're also meeting at a time when India is now a member of the United Nations Security Council, getting in there after nearly 2 decades. Is there greater multilateral cooperation that is possible between India and the United States? But before we go into those substantive issues, I'll call upon Ambassador Blackwell to say something about a meeting and how we plan to conduct this study.
Thank you, Raja, and good to see so many friends out in the audience. And I'll do this briefly because I trust we have a handout for you, which is a press release on this group. If you don't have it, and I see some of you don't, by the time you leave you will. I'm looking at one of my colleagues with my steely blue eyes to be sure that that's in fact the case. This initiative is one co-sponsored by the Aspen Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations. And its purpose is to look over the long term on the US-India relationship and for it to be prescriptive in character. Also, for those of you who might actually read it, you'll be relieved to know that it's only probably going to be 10 or 15 pages long. So this is not going to be a Waverly novel. And as I said, it will be dominated by prescriptions. And there are seven areas we're looking at. China, the rise of Chinese power, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East, of course including Iran, energy, climate change, technology, defense cooperation, and economic relations with the United States and India and trade. So we had a terrific meeting. You'll see a very distinguished group of Americans and Indians who spent, I suppose, 15 hours or so together in the last couple of days talking about this, and we'll be working on it through the summer, and then we'll all gather again in New York in mid-September to conclude the report and to publish it, and then we'll be disseminating it. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Second, although Richard and I are here with the other Americans under these auspices, what we're about to say should not be ascribed to anyone except ourselves. So this does not represent any of the views that were exchanged in these last couple of days. And for those of you journalists, please honor that and don't first write a paragraph saying that we met and then write one that implies that what we're saying somehow represents the views of the group, because that isn't the case. You'll find out the views of the group when we finish the report in September. So we're only speaking personally, all of us, as we proceed with our discussion.
Maybe I'll start with Richard Haas and ask him how he sees the consequences of the targeting of Osama bin Laden deep inside Pakistan, as the President Obama said last Monday. What's the consequence of that for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship? Some of that we're beginning to see being debated in public by the two countries. And second, probably its impact on what the U.S. is going to do in Afghanistan. Would the U.S. declare victory since bin Laden has been got, declare victory and get out? Or would it stay in and drain the swamps of terror that exist in the borderlands of Pakistan and Afghanistan? Easy question, Richard.
Thank you, Raja. This will be the only question and answer, because this will take approximately 45 minutes, so not to worry. Look, the first thing to say is that it makes the world safer but not safe. Terrorism will continue to be a problem, a challenge, at times a scourge. It's a little bit like disease. You can fight it, you can protect yourself against it, you can recover from it, but you can't eliminate it. So as welcome a development as it was and is, that Osama bin Laden is now history, the fact is that Al-Qaeda still remains an operational force, and more broadly, because terrorism has so diffused as an operational challenge, terrorism very much remains a reality. So it's important, as significant an accomplishment as it was, it's important to also understand its limits. Secondly, in terms of the U.S.-Pakistani relationship, it obviously brings to the fore all sorts of questions, many of which existed before. The way I have described it is that Pakistan is something of a limited partner, and what this puts is the word limited under a microscope. And it makes clear the limits to either Pakistani willingness to partner with the United States and the world against terrorism, or Pakistani capacity and ability to partner with the United States and the world against terrorism, or both. Neither one is a particularly comforting conclusion. Each raises its own sets of problems. The specifics have obviously got to, we'll have to see what if anything, is learned about what, if anything, which Pakistanis knew and so forth before this. But I believe we are coming up against, not for the first time, an extraordinarily difficult moment for what has been an extraordinarily complicated and at times difficult relationship, which is the relationship between the United States and Pakistan. And I do think in coming months, and probably longer, you're going to see some extraordinarily direct talks between the United States government and the Pakistani government. And it will have all sorts of consequences for the bilateral relationship, and more broadly, our ability to work together facing not just terrorism, but other challenges that we mutually face, including Afghanistan, which Raja also asked me about. Look, this event does not come absent the context. It's mid-May. The United States has been involved militarily in Afghanistan for almost a decade now in the current phase. And it's approximately, 7 weeks or so before July 1, which is the date that President Obama announced would be the beginning, I emphasize the word beginning, of the reduction in American forces. Now, never articulated, never decided, was the rate of that reduction and what would be the end point. There's a big debate going on within the United States about the scale of our interests in Afghanistan, about the prospects for our policy, and most broadly about the costs, the likely benefits against the almost certain costs of continuing the way we are. Afghanistan is costing us more than $2 billion a week. It's costing us a considerable number of lives and casualties in our military. It takes a lot of time and so forth. The American involvement in Afghanistan is going to grow less, but again, the specific pace or path of that remains to be seen. This is one of those events that can be used by either side to justify its position. My own sense, and I testified on this last week before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is I believe there's a fairly strong case for reducing, and I emphasize the word reducing, the footprint, the American military footprint in Afghanistan. And my sense is that many people will see this most recent development as reinforcing that, but there'll be others who will say just the opposite. They'll say this demonstrates progress, and when a policy is realizing progress, they will say that's time to stay with it rather than to change it. So in a sense, it will not settle the debate within the United States about Afghan policy, but I would simply say withdrawal is not on the table. The United States is going to remain in Afghanistan militarily for some time to come, I think for years to come. And again, what has to be decided is the pace of the drawdown. I'll say one last thing. I do think this will reinforce what you're which you're already beginning to see, which is an increased diplomatic dimension to Afghanistan. And talks not only within Afghanistan between, say, the government there and conceivably elements of the Taliban, but also possibly a greater emphasis on regional diplomacy in Afghanistan. I for one, have advocated the United States start talking to the Taliban. But there's a general, I'd also like to see the United States and India, by the way, talking more about Afghanistan and having India participate in whatever regional diplomacy develops. But I do think that all things being equal, people will see this event as probably contributing somewhat to diplomatic prospects, or at least for prospects for a greater emphasis on a diplomatic dimension of the Afghan situation going forward.
Just turn to Bob Blackman, who has strong ideas on what the U.S. should be doing in Afghanistan, and his views sparked quite a strong debate within. So,
I do have those views, but I want to respond to the question you asked Richard, which he addressed, and I agree with what he said, but I'll elaborate a bit about the effect of the Osama bin Laden raid on U.S. sentiment about Pakistan. Now, of course, it's very early, so one has to be fearless to try to identify longer-term trends. So I'll be fearless. But I have some data to back this up. I think this was and is a watershed in U.S. relations with Pakistan. I think that the fact that Osama bin Laden was hiding or sequestered is probably a better, or where he was, and we'll later find something out about the group that assisted him in that respect, that it has pierced the membrane irrevocably now, of trust between the United States and Pakistan. And I say that because I'll try to vivify it for you by putting it like this. If you had gone to ordinary Americans, not folks like you all and we all who follow these matters closely, but ordinary Americans, and you had 10 days ago said, well, tell me everything you know about Pakistan, about Osama bin Laden, about ISI. Tell me as much as you know. That would have been a very brief conversation because they didn't know anything. They now know. Because in the last week, around the clock, has been the story that he was where he was. And he couldn't have been there without assistance. And polls show 3 out of 4 Americans believe he was being protected by the Pakistan military. Now, this, I believe, will have a very long-lasting effect because the American people are not going to tune in on this story again anytime soon. I think it's a watershed. Now, what will be the effects? And Richard has already addressed this, but I'll put it like this. I think in a conceptual way, the United States will, over time, not today or tomorrow, reduce its strategic dependence on Pakistan, which it has had since 9/11. And it's had it, as you know, because of the supply routes that go to Afghanistan. And that has constrained American freedom of action because we need that supply, though we need those supplies for our forces in Afghanistan. I think, as Richard said in another way, that it's been demonstrated to us the cost of that strategic dependence. And therefore, I think we will reduce it over time. And the only way to reduce it, at least in the first instance, is to reduce the number of our troops in Afghanistan. Because as long as we have 100,000 troops there, we cannot do without the Pakistan supply lines. So I think, as sometimes happens in life, this is a completely unanticipated event will have a very, very big effect on the future of U.S. Relations with Pakistan. One last sentence, which is, again, picking up something Richard said. What will that mean? Our Indian friends, some of you actually in this audience, have believed for a very long time that U.S. assistance to Pakistan should be conditional. And you've made that argument. I believe we're on the way to much greater conditionality in U.S. assistance to Pakistan, depending on how they perform with respect to counterterrorism.
Let me turn to Ambassador Naresh Chandra. As you know that from the mid-50s, that's almost 60 years now, that it is Pakistan factor that's always complicated the India-US relationship and the prospects for India-US cooperation. Cynics in Delhi would say, whatever you do, each time you think something significant was going to happen in the US-Pakistan relationship, it seems to go back to a default position. Nothing seems to change the nature of the US-Pak relationship, and therefore the triangle keeps coming back to the default position, that Indians are cribbing and complaining about the nature of the US-Pak relationship, and that in turn preventing India from doing what's right for itself vis-a-vis the United States. So where do you see this at this point, both in terms of the US-Pak relationship after bin Laden and the specific question of Afghanistan? So how do you see this from Indian perspective?
Well, first is that we are speaking as individuals here. So I would like to reinforce that. Things had begun to change in the early 90s when I was still serving in the government. And what you say was true till then, but after what happened in 98 and then the Kargil affair, I think we in India saw for the first time that US took a fair stand on the India-Pakistan issue and really cautioned Pakistan and disciplined it to line. Although the heights of Kargil and Mashko were recaptured because of the bravery and performance of the Indian soldier, but the fact remains that the US stand taken at that time was a morale booster for everyone here. But I would say that, it's 10 years since I have returned from Washington. The way in US-India relations have gone, have kind of momentum of its own. The old hyphenated relationship is gone. What has happened recently is a bit of a snap. I think whatever the last vestiges of the so-called Pakistani drag on US-India relations seem to have vanished. But to return to what has happened just now, I think I speak for most of the people in India. It has come as no surprise that Osama was hiding in Pakistan. What little surprise has been caused is that he was in Abbottabad and so close to the military academy. As Bob has said, it's impossible to believe that he would be brought in without any local support or a network of supporters and live there for so many years. In fact, the only thing to determine now is how wide and high this network of support goes. And I think that's a matter of inquiry. And we will, because as far as Pakistani denials or ISI denials have been, they seem to be very innocent persons. They did not know what AQ Ha was up to. They do not still know what is the address of Dawood Ibrahim in Karachi. We of course know his telephone number, his address, but these gentlemen are so busy with more important matters that they don't know these simple things. But the fact is that today, and our discussion has been focused on this issue, of course, the security concerns to our West. I'm sure US will take corrective actions, but what we have to analyze are the consequences, particularly the unintended consequences that will follow. We have to see that the space vacated in the sense of withdrawal or reduction of troops by the United States, are there any other neighbors who will try to occupy that space and start playing the great game all over again? So these are the issues which need careful analysis. As far as India's interest and program in Afghanistan is concerned, it is to prop up and strengthen the institutions, the state institutions of the Afghan government, and do everything possible to support them within, of course, the permissions and the wishes of the Afghani people and the government of Afghanistan. And I think this is being appreciated, that India's actions in Afghanistan are more of a constructive nature. They are people-directed, provision of electricity, construction of roads, establishment and running of hospitals, training, education and the like, as opposed to just use of force. Of course, force is needed to maintain the security and stability, but India's approach to Afghanistan is quite different. We have also spent a lot of time and not allowed the security concerns to distract us from the more positive areas of cooperation between USA and India in relating to cooperation in developing new technologies and mutual transfers of technology, and working together on issues of common concern like the environment, clean green energy, and issues pertaining to agriculture, education, healthcare, so that those important aspects are not lost sight of. If somebody had told me that how things will improve after I returned from Washington to India, I would have returned much sooner.
I think that's a good point on which to go to, Jamshid Godrej. Is there too much of geopolitics that we keep expecting things from the United States, those things don't happen, then we are kind of disappointed, while actually the real progress has taken place on the economic front, on the trade front, on areas which you are so deeply involved. And there's also quite a bit of possibilities in new areas like what we do on green technologies, etc. So you think while the Delhi keeps debating big geopolitics, actually the rest of India is far more interested in building lasting, deep economic, technological partnership with the United States?
Yeah, actually, Raja, as far as Indian industry is concerned today, their most important economic relationships is with the US and has been for some time, and I suspect that will continue for a long time to come. And I think that it's basically because the values that we believe in, both India and the US, and business practices are very aligned. And it's very interesting to see that whenever there's a political debate in India or in the United States, whether it's on outsourcing or it's on some other economic issue, it always settles down where business interests converge. And I think that we don't have that rhetoric anymore today on economic issues. I think there is a deep understanding within US businesses today that working with India benefits outsourcing on services, outsourcing on R&D. The partnerships that are being built today in India and have been built over a long period of time are very beneficial to both companies on both sides and peoples on both sides. And this, I see this only getting stronger over time. I think the dissonance that has happened at various points of time on this relationship have got to do with conditionalities on trade. They've got to do with denials, say on high technology, where we are interested in developing high technology. They have to do with areas where some strategic coincidence is not happening the way it should happen. But I think that there is a better understanding today that yes, we have to have defense cooperation, we have to have defense production cooperation, we have to have cooperation on energy issues. I think both India and the US are faced with the issue of using coal as the main source of power generation. What do we do about that? How do we move ahead in that respect? The role that, for instance, interventions in climate change are going to benefit both. How is that going to really play out? And I think that the closest relationships that we are seeing today are on a business-to-business level, but where we need to really improve is on R&D. There's a huge area of R&D cooperation between institutions in India, between universities in India, between individuals, scientists, etc. I think there's a huge area of cooperation possible, despite the fact that for Indian students, the US is still the preferred choice to get an education. I think that what should develop as a result of that, especially on technology cooperation and R&D, has not happened, and that could be a big piece going forward. Especially on clean energy and climate change, I think if you remove the political issues of Copenhagen and Cancun and all these big international meetings, I think underlying that, there's a very good understanding as to what is possible today to do between India and the US on clean energy. There's a great interest in energy efficiency. There's a great interest on super efficient appliances. There's a great interest in understanding where we can work jointly on intervention on climate change. And so I think that if we can work on the government to government as well as the private sector to private sector cooperation in these areas, the benefits for both are very, very high. And so I would say that I'm particularly keen on some of the things that are being talked about in the energy field. I think energy security is a major concern in the US. It is a major concern for us. Our dependence on oil and gas from the Middle East is a geopolitical issue that we have to deal with. The US has to deal with that also. So there's a lot of cooperation that's possible there.
What I'll do is I'll try and get a set of opening comments on China, and then we'll open up for discussion. I think we'll have quite a bit of time for quite an interactive session following that. Maybe Richard, I'll start with you. What's the mood in the US on China? When this administration came in, there was about a G2. Since then, there's been kind of more emphasis on hedging against the rise of China.
The question of China's rise and what sort of personality or character an ever stronger China takes is one of the big geopolitical questions of our time. And we're sitting here in New Delhi while the United States and China right now are having their semi-annual strategic and economic dialogue talks in Washington. I think when this administration began, it began on a fairly optimistic footing vis-a-vis China, that China was already prepared in the thinking of some to play a responsible global role, essentially to be a quote-unquote stakeholder. What I believe the administration has learned over the last nearly 2.5 years is that may one day prove true, but it is not yet true. And that in virtually every realm, China is doing things which are not yet consistent with what we would hope to see. So there's large disagreements between the United States and China, obviously in the economic realm, but also in various political and strategic domains. So what you are seeing is has been a slight adjustment to U.S. policy towards China, which is to increasingly invest more time and energy, in particular with traditional American friends and allies throughout Asia. And this comes against the backdrop of what would be generously or diplomatically called more assertive Chinese statements and actions over the last year about the South China Sea and more broadly about the regional and global situation. And the United States, in my view, has correctly reinvigorated some of its most central relationships in that part of the world with Japan, with Korea. It's developed relationships with some of the ASEAN countries, and I believe the relationship between the United States and India is more robust than it was. All of these things make sense in their own right, but it was also, I believe, in many cases, a natural reaction, which everyone shared, to what was seen as China, to some extent, overreaching. And people always want to categorize what China's doing and say it's friend or something else, or it's got this or that dimension, and the answer is it's not easy to characterize it or pigeonhole it in a single way, and China is still very much evolving, not just economically, but in every other way. So to make a long story short, what you see is the United States trying to work with China across the board to encourage it to play what we see as a responsible role. And so you'll have selective areas of cooperation between the United States, but you also have selective areas where the United States and China do not see eye to eye. And to some extent, we'll try to work those out across the negotiating table. In other cases, though, the United States will simply act either independently or, again, with its traditional friends and allies and to bring about those outcomes regionally or globally it feels it needs.
Hope you want to step in on this.
Nobody knows what China is going to be like in 10 years. Nobody knows what kind of leadership we're going to be dealing with. Nobody knows what the situation inside China will be, whether the Chinese Communist Party will be able to square the circle of their people get more and more economic freedom but are denied political freedom and so forth. But what I think we do know is likely in the next 10 years is an ever stronger China in every dimension. And India will have to cope with that, and the United States will have to cope with that. I think it is the most important strategic challenge for both countries in the next couple of decades is dealing with the rise of Chinese power. Notice I didn't say containing China. We hope that we wouldn't get to that point, because for both India and the United States, a long-term confrontation with China would have enormous costs. We might have to do it if Chinese behavior forces us to do it, but that would be a worst case. And I think, as Richard just said, and certainly in Washington this is felt by most folks, and I think so here you would know better, that everything should be done to try to avoid that and to try to encourage the Chinese to behave more responsibly than they have thus far. Because in issues of trade and their currency and their geopolitical reach in the South China Sea and stapling visas of Kashmiris and all of that over the last 18 months, they have not behaved well, in my opinion. We'll see if there's a course correction. Finally, the transformation of U.S.-India relations, in my judgment, for what it's worth, at its core from 2001 onward, was because of the United States concluding that India would be a valuable partner in seeking to manage over time the rise of Chinese power. And I would even go so far as to say that without that strategic conviction across both parties in Washington, there would have been no civil nuclear deal. That the United States would not have made such an enormous exception in the non-proliferation regime regarding India as it did. So it was at the core of America's strategic judgment. Our Indian friends can say how it figures in their judgment, but I think it'll be a major dimension now from this period forward, and one just hopes, as I said, that, to use, you'll recall, now President of the World Bank, but then Deputy Secretary of State, Bob Zoellick's phrase, we want them to be a responsible stakeholder, you remember. They haven't been a responsible stakeholder, or at least not a sufficiently responsible stakeholder. And we hope that the United States and India and dozens of other countries can persuade China to become a more responsible actor in the international system. Tying the two together, though, we find China deeply involved in Pakistan. China and Pakistan have, by most definitions, a military relationship of allies. And I myself believe that one of the reasons for that is that China seeks to divert India from a more global rise of power by cooperating with Pakistan to keep India preoccupied in South Asia. I think that's a Chinese grand strategy. I think it's been so for some time. And I would again regard that as irresponsible behavior, and certainly not behavior that contributes to peace and security. So China will be writ large for us, for you, for the nations, all the nations of Asia, for as far forward as I can see.
To turn to Jamshid and ask him a question, just what Bob just now said, that the Chinese might be trying to keep India down, that's kind of complete matter of conviction in Delhi in the so-called strategic community. But if you look at the rest of India, I think there is a dramatic expansion of the economic and the commercial relationship with China. That the trade has hit $60 billion last year. The target has been set for 100 billion, which is going to happen, they say 2014, but I think it's going to happen in the next 2 years. That the Indian industry seems to, which initially used to complain about China, now seems to love China. That you have massive amounts of money that's being given by the Chinese, are willing to lend money to buy Chinese equipment. So are we becoming like the United States, that whatever might be the strategic considerations, that the interdependence with China is going to grow so much that whatever the strategists in Delhi might think about it, the economic logic, just as it's happened in the United States, where their mutual interdependence constrains strategic conflict, are we seeing something similar happen in India as well?
Well, Raja, there's no doubt that business with China, both on the investment side as well as on the trade side, has dramatically increased. But I think to some extent, or to a fairly large extent, it is at the cost of Indian industry. I think we still live with a legacy in India of higher costs, especially on infrastructure. We do not have the scale of manufacturing that China has. I think if you just take the power sector as an example, we have had a monopoly in power generating equipment in the government. It's spread a little bit in the private sector, but nowhere as deep as it has in the government. And I think that India's capacity has been constrained to a very great extent because of the availability of power. And here you have the Chinese who step in and they say that, here's our equipment. It may not be as good as the best equipment in the world, but it's good enough. And it will last for enough time for you to recoup your investment. And by the way, we will always give you long-term financing at very good rates. So it becomes a no-brainer to go and buy the Chinese equipment, which is what is exactly that's happening. And I think that the danger for us here is not just in power equipment. I think if you see the small and medium industry, it is also being deeply affected by Chinese competitive position. And because their systems are fairly opaque in China, in the sense of not really knowing what are their raw material costs, what are the subsidies implicit or explicit in their system, etc., it becomes actually quite difficult to compete. So yes, there is a good business opportunity to import, and where we need the equipment, it will be good for India. But I think that the cooperation that we need to build together is still not happened. I think it's a very sort of China's taken a strategic position in certain industries. Telecommunications is another one, partly because of our own fault. We never really developed a strong telecommunication industry in India. You see, we had a government monopoly which was not able to meet the requirements of the market, and so somebody stepped in and taken that business. And so from a free market position point of view, you could say that's fine. There's nothing wrong in that. There was a need for it, and they stepped in and they did it. I think we need to put our house in order. Even today, I think there's huge amounts of liberalization that we need to make Indian industry more competitive. And I think that's a core piece here, that whilst we are working a lot with China in trade and investment, but I think that Indian industry could get very significantly damaged over time if we don't put our own house in order. I think the issue of GST has been very much at the top of our minds in industry. We need to fix these things. We need to fix our infrastructure. So I think the structural reforms that still are pending, if we don't get on with those, I think we would be hurt. But I think in the moment we are taking advantage of these low costs.
Before I turn to the audience, I want to ask you something. How do you balance this, the economic and the strategic in dealing with China? And there, what is our relationship with the US? Can it help us balance this better?
I agree with Jamshed, and we have to see the concern and the challenge part. I think the rise of China in one way is a very good thing for us because it poses a challenge, and the Indian industry and others have to rise to it. And if China and Chinese market grows, it's an opportunity for us and we should take full advantage of it. Today the trade is not as it should be because we seem to be exporting raw materials and buying capital equipment and other items of merchandise, so the terms need to be changed. But I would like to go back a little to what Bob says. While it is true US and India need to cooperate in this part of the world, especially on the Indian Ocean and Malacca Straits and so on, the fact remains that I think the Indian side firmly believes, and US accepts it, that India is not going to be a frontline state or anything, or take part in any containment exercise to contain or constrain China. Our policy with China is independent. It is based on a desire for more mutual trust and benefit. But at the same time, we cannot overlook what is going on in our neighborhood, the type of relationship that exists between China and Pakistan, and the Chinese moves into Myanmar ports there, and Pakistan coast, at Sri Lanka. So there is a very obvious attempt at some kind of an encirclement or constraining, but I don't think we should immediately switch to a confrontation mode. What the government is doing, following a multi-layered policy with China, with a degree of preparation and patience, I should think. But the fact remains that at our borders and in terms of defense preparedness, more attention is certainly needed, because north of the line of control, they have developed infrastructure, airfields, road networks, which enables them to move troops much faster to the border than before. I'm told they have reduced the time for mobilizing troops at the border, large quantities, couple of divisions, to one-sixth of the from 90 days to 15 days. So what they will take notice of when dealing with India is how well prepared we are, and in this case we can't neglect either defense preparedness or the infrastructure on south of our border. Now the idea is that short of joining a collective, there is no reason why cooperation with ASEAN countries, Sri Lanka, Japan, Australia, will not help put India in a more advantageous position than it is today.
I think that's a good set of comments to go to the audience. I'm sure someone is going to get microphones to you. But before we proceed, I just want to say, look, this is a room full of smart people. Not on the dais, but in the audience. Many of you are familiar with the issues here. So I would urge all of you to make short comments and shorter questions, because we don't need to explain too much of the context, because I'm sure everyone gets it pretty quickly here. So therefore, please be short. It is a comment or a question, and so that many people can ask questions. So.
First of all, I'm Sunil Mehra and I'm not a journalist.
That's no crime. That's not a crime. So.
Yeah. No, I think Ambassador Blackwell very rightly mentioned, while setting the tone of the meeting, that it should not be quoted. This is more of at a personal level you are sharing your views. My question is, that if you look at the Indo-US relations, first 60 years, 50s to 60s, government-to-government relations may not have been that good, or they have been at loggerheads. But people to people, there was much more harmony. But if you look at the last couple of years, the government-to-government relations have improved, but there is some kind of disharmony developing at people to people. And here I would like to quote the promos, like, in the US media, a factory opened in Mexico, Brazil or India has led to this kind of unemployment in US. So I would like to know that, rather than, question is, dependency of the Indo-US relations on the reactionary geopolitics, can it be on the more positive people-to-people relation and other commonalities like democracy and the free market forces?
There are, of course, the trade issues and Buffalo and Bangalore and that sort of thing. But at least the latest poll I saw is India is the third most popular country among the American people after Britain and Canada. So I don't think there's a problem with the American people. There is a problem with a sometimes protectionist Congress and so forth, but those people will come and go. I think India is deeply admired in the United States and has been for some time, even before its defeat of Pakistan in the cricket match. And it was deeply admired for values for decades, democratic values, and now its economic ascendance has been added to that. So I won't speak to how Indians think about Americans, but again, I've seen polls which suggest there's no erosion of, there's sometimes frustration about visa issues, but there's no erosion in the basic Indian admiration for America, not always for American policies, but Richard and I don't always have admiration for for American policy, so that seems okay. So I think that part of the relationship is extremely strong. I think it's now true. Richard probably has these. There are now more Indians in American universities than Chinese. There are now more Indians than any other nationality. So I'm not worried at all about that.
James Lamont.
I'd like to understand better the prospect of US aid being cut to Pakistan, and whether you might comment on what the lessons were from last time round aid was pared back, and I'm thinking about after the nuclear tests that Pakistan conducted. And I understand that contact with the Pakistani top brass literally vaporized after that happened, and whether you would have similar fears now. The second question is whether in Washington you fear that if you step back, China steps in. And I was very struck by Prime Minister Gilani's emphasis of China last night in his speech in Parliament.
Richard,
what I believe will happen is the U.S.-Pakistani relationship is going to be looked at with great scrutiny. And the reason is that two of the foreign policies that matter most to the United States are what happens in Afghanistan and what happens against terror. And in both cases, Pakistan is judged to be playing an unhelpful role. It provides sanctuary to the Afghan Taliban, vastly complicating U.S. policy aims in Afghanistan. And either, again, through complicity or a lack of capacity, it has provided sanctuary to terrorists, including al-Qaeda, within Pakistan itself. What I believe, the conclusion I believe that will be drawn, at least initially, is not to end all aid to Pakistan, but rather, and I believe Ambassador Blackwell said this, to condition it much more specifically going forward. That the lesson of after 9/11 is that if the United States is going to try to be forthcoming towards Pakistan, it's got to be quite explicitly tied to performance. Now, it remains to be seen what the conditions are and so forth, and whether ultimately those are acceptable to the Pakistanis. So I don't know how all of this will play out, but I do believe that the only way you will generate congressional support and public support more broadly for continued economic and military aid to Pakistan is much greater assurances about how that aid is to be used, along with mechanisms for following up, so we can be confident that, in fact, it has been used in ways that are consistent with American objectives for furnishing the aid in the first place. So it's, in that sense, it'll become a more conditional relationship all around.
Bob, you want to add anything?
No.
Yeah. Professor Satish Kumar.
Thank you. Ambassador Blackwell said that one way of reducing strategic dependence on Pakistan will be to reduce the number of troops in Afghanistan. Now, my question is that do you think there is significant scope for reduction of troops, given the fact that the ground realities have not yet improved very much? The military position of the allied forces is not very strong in the south and the east. The Pakistani support to the Afghan Taliban will continue, and the Afghan National Army, the Afghan police is not strong enough. So do you really think out of 100,000 you'll be able to reduce enough numbers as to reduce dependence on the supply lines? A related question is that there have been media reports, including in the New York Times, that sometime this month talks might begin in Turkey between the Taliban and the Afghan government and the United States, including perhaps India being on board. And does that suggest, if that is true, does that suggest there are indications that some kind of efforts are being made to talk to the Taliban, they're enabling further reduction in sanctions?
Well, on the first issue, today, half of our support for our forces in Afghanistan comes through the northern route, half. And that's for 100,000 troops. If we get to 35,000 troops, we can supply 25,000 troops without that supply route from Pakistan. We can't do it when we have such a large contingent in southeastern Afghanistan. So the answer is yes, we can. The issue of should we is one that I've written about, Richard's written about, we have similar views, that the U.S., and I'll let him chime in, but I'll say just the U.S. commitment to Afghanistan is far out of correlation with our vital interests there. We're now at $2 billion a week, 100,000 troops. There are 100 Al-Qaeda there, if you think of that math, and so forth. So I've advocated, Richard's advocated, others have advocated a smaller force, a reduced mission, and a longer stay. So I'm going to clear, we're not recommending a total American military withdrawal, which both of us oppose, but a smaller force with a reduced mission for a longer stay. We'll have to see how that debate turns out in the U.S., and I do think it will be affected to some degree by what happened with Osama bin Laden to some degree. But we're, as you know, the President's going to announce in 2 months the number of his first withdrawal, and so we'll see what that is. But we are, now I'll be predictive, we're on a down slope with respect to the U.S. commitment in Afghanistan, in my opinion. And the question is, how steep is the slope? And is there a plateau at some point where we level off and keep forces there, or is the slope all the way out? Richard, you should chime in here if you want to.
In terms of the true questions, that's exactly right. And I was just going to respond to the second half of your question, because I agree with what Bob said on the diplomatic side. I think there is a growing interest in testing Taliban intentions. In the past, it was widely judged that the return of the Taliban to positions of strength in Afghanistan would inevitably lead to a return of Al-Qaeda. There are now reasons to question that, or at least to say we want to test that. So I believe that there is a place for diplomacy here. Directly, I would recommend with the Taliban to get a better sense of what their intentions are, and to remind them that if they ever were to regain positions in Afghanistan and were to associate themselves with Al-Qaeda, they would once again be targeted by American military power. On the other hand, if they were willing to not do that, then I believe the question of their potential role in Afghanistan is something then that is a legitimate question for diplomacy. So I believe it's quite possible within the next few months you will see continuing contacts between the Afghan government and elements of the Taliban. I believe it's possible you will see conversations between the United States government and elements of the Taliban. And I would hope all of this is part, again, of a larger diplomatic process where regional countries are brought in. I am not sitting here advocating some kind of an artificial power-sharing arrangement. I believe that would not be acceptable to important aspects of Afghan society and the Afghan government. And indeed, one of the big questions, and you know this as well or better than I do, is one has to think of Afghanistan not simply in terms of the politics of the federal government, but also the decentralized politics of the country. So all of this, I believe now, though, is legitimate and indeed desirable subject for diplomacy. So coming back to something Ambassador Blackwell said, I believe you will see a gradual dialing down of the numbers of American and international forces. And potentially you'll see a reduction in that part of the mission of these forces, which has brought them into combat with the Taliban. Instead, you will probably see a greater emphasis on training of Afghan forces and continued targeting of terrorists. And at the same time, you're likely to see a dialing up, so to speak, of various diplomatic dimensions to the Afghan challenge.
Ambassador Chandra, since we are on an important question on the U.S. reduction of the U.S. footprint and an expanded engagement of the Taliban, how should India look at it? How should we think about it?
Well, we naturally wish for a level of public order and stability which enables Indian projects and Indian personnel to execute them in an atmosphere conducive to safety and development. So we'll be seeing the position very carefully, and in consultation with the Afghan government, we have to ensure that our people are safe and that we are able to carry on our activities. But I think while US withdraws, they will also have to interact and engage Pakistan more seriously, because the type of activity they have indulged in, and at least in one case, attack on the Indian embassy at Kabul, the hand of ISI was clearly exposed. I think a tough warning will have to be.
Can I just follow up one thing there? Yeah, sure. You asked the question about Pakistan, and I talked about aid. I just wanted to follow up on something Ambassador Chandra said, which is there's a lot of unhappiness in Pakistan about what is being described as American violations of Pakistani sovereignty. And I think the other lesson of the last week or so is that countries such as the United States, I'll just speak for the United States, I'll speak about American policy, I don't speak for the United States now, will take matters in their own hands, as the United States did in the killing of Osama bin Laden, when Pakistan does not fulfill the obligations that come with sovereignty. Pakistan cannot simply expect the rights of sovereignty if it does not fulfill all the obligations of sovereignty. And one of the obligations Pakistan has is to make sure that its territory was not used to harbor global terrorists such as Osama bin Laden. So I think in the future, there's not simply the question of the American aid relationship with Pakistan, which both Bob and I think is likely to become much more conditioned, but also the degree of independent American military action, I would think, is going to be directly proportional to how much Pakistan is willing and able to make sure its territory is not used to house global terrorists. And it's almost that simple going forward. And so I think, again, this will be a real test for Pakistan's willingness and ability to meet its international obligations.
Can I just chime in on, to tie the two together, earlier question about conditionality. If you were thinking, well, what kind of conditionality one might have, and of course the Congress is excellent on 27 conditions on any particular piece of legislation, but surely one that will be considered is aid to the Haqqani network and to the Afghan Taliban, because that assistance from ISI supports the killing of Americans. Now imagine that you're a member of the administration and you're testifying in one of those congressmen or senators saying, are you asking me to vote for aid after the episode last week, and when it is common knowledge around the U.S. government that the Pakistan military is supporting elements that are killing Americans? And we have the administration, and I would say the past two administrations, have been willing, because of our strategic dependence on Pakistan, to turn the other way on that. I think that the raid and the American reaction to the raid, and then the Pakistan reaction to the American reaction, is going to bring these kinds of questions much more to the fore and connect them with aid levels, especially military aid levels.
I'm going to Dr. Omi Marwa.
My name is Omkar Marwa. I am a former professor at the University of Geneva at the graduation level. I'd like to pick up two words that have been mentioned and around which we have made a lot of discussion. One is the word that you mentioned, watershed. Watershed. U.S.-Pakistani relations are at a watershed. And the other thing is this question of reductions. Now, I'd like to get you to speculate as to what would be the Pakistani reaction to the conditionalities. I know it's difficult, but I think your experts will have taken this into account if the question of conditionalities has come up. It's very important for the simple reason that it's not enough to speak about conditionalities or general statements. It's a question of how you will interact with the Pakistan army. And that is the heart of the whole issue. I would say that the question of reduction is that the road to Kandahar lies through Islamabad. And I'd like to see what would be the framework in which you would work out this new conditionalities that would make a difference as far as the Pakistan Army is concerned. Thank
I'm
you.
going to take another question. Ambassador Rajiv Sikri, you want to see?
Master Blackwell, you had mentioned that at the heart of the Indo-US strategic engagement was the China factor. But the USA has not actually addressed India's security concerns vis-à-vis China, which have nothing to do with the South China Sea or East Asia, but on the land borders. Would the USA be willing to adopt a posture that is somewhat supportive of India's security concerns on the land border?
Should I? Well, I hope so. I hope so. But you notice I'm not in government now, so I can have my opinion. But I think that would be a sensible and positive move by the United States. But I do want to say one other thing about and I agree with you that the United States hasn't addressed that particular dimension of India's problems with China. But please don't say the United States is not addressing India's concerns about China. It is addressing them every day through our military deployments in Asia. Every day. And the enormous commitment we make and the American taxpayer makes to keep a balance of power in Asia. And you can imagine what India's position would be without those American military assets in Asia. So that's not as direct as what you've suggested. And I say I support it, and I hope we'll do it. But I didn't want to let that get away. The only other thing I would say, on conditionality, I think those are terrific questions. Conditionality. Neither Richard nor I said it would work. We just said that's, in our judgment, the most likely trajectory of the policy. What would the Pakistanis do in that respect? You need to ask the Pakistanis. I don't think asking an American to speculate on what they would do, because there are so many nuances here. What exactly is the conditionality? They make their own calculations in their own minds about their pros and cons. But what we were saying was, and I certainly support this much greater conditionality, that we think it's likely to happen, and I think it's a good thing that finally the United States is going to stop turning away from Pakistan behavior in this regard, and then we'll see what they do, and they'll have to make their own calculations.
Richard, you want to add to this?
Just very briefly, after 9/11, there was a general hope that by greater strategic association with Pakistan, by building up Pakistani capabilities, you would get improved Pakistani performance on matters that mattered most to the United States, including terrorism and Afghanistan, and obviously the United States has been disappointed on that. So I think going forward, you can expect to see conditionality that aims at the level and the direction of effort, and also to some extent is linked to results. And we'll just have to, we'll see what the specifics are, and again, we'll see what the Pakistani reaction is. But I do think that for the foreseeable future, this relationship is going to become, in that sense, trying to think of the adjective through my jet lag, but it's going to have to become a slightly more transactional relationship and more performance-based and efforts-based relationship rather than a promise-based relationship.
Can I just put it in another vivid way? Certainly since 9/11, the United States, and this was successive administrations, developed a strategy which was based on, Richard adverted this earlier, that if the United States increased its military and civil society assistance to Pakistan, that it would get the benefit of increased Pakistan cooperation on the core matters that affected American national interests. That was a plausible strategy. It failed. It failed. Strategies sometimes fail. And when strategies fail, you can do one of two things. If the objective is important, you can continue a failed strategy, a phenomenon that historically America is particularly expert at, or you can change your strategy. And that's the debate that's now going to happen, is happening in Washington, is how do we change our strategy? We do not want to have self-inflicted wounds here. Pakistan remains very important to us. It has nuclear weapons and all the rest. But there is now, I believe, and it's just getting started, there'll be a fundamental review of our strategy toward Pakistan that we haven't had in very long time. And I think it'll, and Richard agrees, will come out about where we said. We didn't try to do the details, we tried to do the conceptual nature of that inquiry.
As always, as we begin to warm up, you begin to run against the clock. So the next questions will have to be short, brief, and almost like television style. So look for a soundbite right at the back, gentleman there. Yes, please.
Yeah, we're at an Indian, we'd be looking for something like what Japan got, defense and economic cover. As a military strategist, be careful about a stealth nuclear missile, because this could happen, from Pakistan. And it would be better if American troops, if they had to withdraw, came into India. I've never understood why we've never given American troops a base. Okay. That's all.
Thanks. Sir, you've been waiting patiently here. Brief, please.
My question, Ambassador, in one of your earlier meetings at this Aspen Institute, you proposed a very novel solution to the Afghan problem, balkanizing it. Have you had time since then to reconsider it?
Yeah. One more thing. Yeah. Ambassador Jha.
I think that was a rhetorical question. No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, with the deadline of 1st July approaching rapidly, I feel that the diplomatic efforts at resolving the Afghan dilemma, Afghan issue, would probably redouble itself. Now, in this entire scenario, Pakistan would do its utmost to make sure that India doesn't have much of a say in it.
It is as far as possible, India is split from any, kept out of any diplomatic agreement that follows. And I hope it will be kept in mind, be borne in mind in view of our close strategic and political and economic ties with Afghanistan. Our presence at any point should be taken forward, should be part of the American strategy in evolving this. Also, Pakistan's obsession with strategic depth. Now, in your article or your remarks about de facto partition of Afghanistan referred to a while ago, even if that were to happen, Pakistan would still be able to get a certain strategic depth in the Pashtun area of Afghanistan. So I don't know how that aspect of it. It may help or may not help solve Afghanistan's problem, but Pakistan's quest for strategic depth would still be there and have still been secured. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think that's absolutely right. And then the question arises, how much should the Americans pay in blood and treasure to prevent Pakistan from having strategic depth in Afghanistan, is the question. And should it pay $2 billion a week to prevent that? My answer is no. It shouldn't. That our vital national interests are not sufficiently connected to that piece of real estate to justify that. And I'll just make one other point about this, just to give you some sense. In Washington, there's now a debate about whether we can afford $100 million of assistance to Egypt. And we all know what's been happening in Egypt. We all know it's the most important Arab country. It's the hub of Araby and so forth. And I hope eventually we will have some number of aid to Egypt, because I think they need our help, those brave people, in Tahrir Square. $100 million is 9 hours of the annual American expenditure on Afghanistan. Who in this audience believes that Helmand Province is as important to American vital interests as Egypt? So we are out of whack here in terms of what we are spending our money on, and therefore we shouldn't run for the door. That would be a mistake. But we shouldn't keep this level of expenditure blood and treasure. 500 Americans died last year in Afghanistan. That may seem a small number unless it was your son or daughter. Then it wouldn't seem like such a small number. So I think we have to make that adjustment and should make that adjustment. But your point about strategic depth is just exactly right. And I don't know what India wishes to pay in blood and treasure to keep Pakistan from having strategic depth in Afghanistan.
Okay, anybody wants to come on this?
I can answer. You know, nobody wants to. I think India will not pay a rupee. But the point is that India would not want this strategic depth argument to be taken seriously. I am told by military experts that in the today's technology applied to battle and war, it is sheer nonsense. In the days of missiles and multi-role aircraft, it is just an argument of convenience to dominate a part or the whole of Afghanistan used by Pakistan. It's a sham argument.
I think Smita Purushottam has been waiting for a long time.
Thank you. I'm going to take this opportunity to, first of all, thank Mr. Godrej for bringing to our attention the need for technological upgradation of the Indian industry, and to invite him to participate in an initiative of our institute on which we're going to work on technology indigenization and upgradation. My question is to Ambassador Blackwell, and this is regarding some interesting press reports that have come out in the Russian press regarding the forthcoming visit of President Zardari to Russia. And in that, they've mentioned that Pakistan has offered outlet to the sea, the usual refrain from the
warm
old
water
trade
ports,
case. Yeah. And the second thing is that after the MMRCA decision, that the Russians should now look at Pakistan as an alternative market. Of course, this is not going to happen, and Russia is not going to put its eggs in the Pakistani basket at all. But would the US contemplate a reset in Asia together with India and Russia on Afghanistan, and even bringing some sense to Pakistan? And basically, yes.
You want to take another one? Sure.
Krishnappa at the back.
Short question. How would America respond if India were to violate Pakistani sovereignty and do some extraction of, say, one of the...
How would US react if India was to violate Pakistani sovereignty?
Is it from the Air Force? Or
The question was, how would...
The question is, can India violate Pakistan's sovereignty? How would the US react to the India?
Oh, I haven't been out of government so long that I'm going to try to answer a question like that. But I will go back to the other good question and just say on Russia, and Richard could develop this, the kind of diplomatic effort that he's describing, the regional diplomatic effort, obviously can't be done without the Russians and without the Chinese and without the Pakistanis and without the Indians. And then, of course, the most awkward, not for you all, but for us, it also can't be done without the Iranians. And that's a particular problem for the United States, of course, given our current policy, which I support, toward Iran. And how one gets past that, I don't know. But certainly, we're talking to the Russians about Afghanistan. They are now being extremely helpful in providing the supply, the northern supply route that I described earlier. And I congratulate the administration for its policy toward Russia, which I think has been quite skilled and positive. Yes, you have to have all those countries involved. And I would hope that, consistent with what Richard was suggesting, is reaching out to the Taliban, which I don't object to. I don't think anything will come of it, but I don't object to. It's worth a try, as he said. It's worth a try. But I would like, coincident with that, is a much greater effort by the United States on the regional issue. Because if Afghanistan ever really does become a normal, peaceful country whose territorial integrity is respected by its neighbors, it can only come through this regional agreement. So we should start trying. Again, under current circumstances, that's a long shot, for sure, but especially because of Pakistan. But we ought to try. It's what diplomats... In olden days, this was called diplomacy. It's almost a lost art now, but it used to be called diplomacy. You'll find it in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington.
Richard, you want to come in on this? Okay, I think we're going to take the last set of questions. Gentlemen, make it very brief now. We are crossing over.
My question, will USA and India join hand in dealing with the terrorism? And up to what extent they can join hand, and what will be the mode of its eradication and the quantum of success it can be achieved?
Thank you. Very, very good questions. Yeah, at the back, gentlemen. What was that question? How much can India and US cooperate in counterterrorism?
Against terrorism. Ambassador Blackwell had earlier defined similar for good Taliban versus bad Taliban. Seems like the definition is now the bad Taliban is the ones that go for Pakistan, the good ones that they're going for, not linked up with the Al-Qaeda. But more important is, you talked about balance of power. Once the US leaves the area, obviously there is going to be the Pakistani and the Chinese presence going after this multi-trillion-dollar wealth of minerals that everybody seems to forget every now and then. And how do we address this balance of power to what is the new proposed balance of power? You've mentioned the regional solution, but what do you think was the preferred outcome?
The last word from the floor goes to Ambassador Sgotra.
Raja, a country which has very large salience to the Afghanistan situation. The word has not been mentioned, Iran. Second question is, this discussion has degenerated into U.S.-Pakistan relations, U.S.-China relations. What is the future of U.S.-India relations? Briefly.
Okay, I think we had three sets of issues. One, how much India and the US can cooperate in counterterrorism. Then there was the question of, has the bad Taliban become the good Taliban? And in this, the last question about what about the future, I think that's the title of our conference. But every one of these themes connect to what we're trying to do, and I think that's part of the project that's being done.
Yeah, I was going to say that, Ambassador, we look forward to your reading our document in September on the future of the relationship. It's quite bright, and it's quite bright because of the people-to-people and the values that we were discussing earlier. But it's also quite bright because if you do a comparison of U.S. and India's vital national interests, they're virtually identical. So we'll argue about tactics and strategy and so forth, but over the long term, they're virtually identical. On the good Taliban, bad Taliban, I'll just do that one. The United States, it seems to me, is obligated, given the situation in Afghanistan, to try to find a negotiated outcome. And in wars, this may come as a shock, you negotiate with the enemy. That's actually what you do. And so, even if the odds are long, which I regard them as very long, I think the United States should try to test, as Richard said, whether there's any willingness of elements of the Taliban to find a solution which doesn't depend on their use of force and so forth. I think it will fail, but I think we ought to do it. I'll leave it there, and Richard can, Naresh and Jamshid can.
Quickly on the Taliban, the United States has a vital national interest that Afghanistan's real estate, its territory, is not used to launch terrorist strikes. We have other interests, but they're not necessarily vital. So there's many aspects of the Taliban that are truly unattractive, and that would affect our relationship, and it might affect other instruments the United States would bring to bear. But the one way I know we will try to stop or kill Taliban is if they once again establish positions in Afghanistan and allow those positions to be exploited by groups like Al-Qaeda. But I think it's important for the United States, it's necessary for the United States to distinguish between that set of Taliban behaviors and others. So it's not fair, it's a caricature to say we're distinguishing between good Taliban and bad Taliban. What I think we're trying to do is distinguish between vital American interests and other American interests or preferences. And it's one thing to spend an awful lot of blood and treasure on vital national interests. I do not think it's responsible to your own citizenry, not to mention the men and women you have in uniform, to necessarily ask them to put their lives at risk on behalf of interests which are less than vital. You do have other national security or foreign policy instruments to do that. In the case of Iran, I think it was a good question, and I agree. I actually, despite all of our differences with the government of Iran, historically Iran has at times played a responsible role vis-a-vis Afghanistan, and I would be open to Iranian participation in various sorts of conversations about the future of Afghanistan. Depending upon their behavior and so forth, we might try to encourage it or discourage it, but I would not, off the top, rule it out. Lastly, on the U.S.-India relationship, I agree with the ambassador. The prospects are bright, and it's both an opportunity and a challenge for both governments and both countries. The real question is whether on both sides people are willing to, if you will, take advantage of those opportunities, put aside some of the dogmas of the past, and essentially begin to use my favorite phrase, develop habits of cooperation, whether it's the kind of issues we're talking about here, Afghanistan, what have you, but also a much broader set of issues. Ultimately, this relationship is going to depend not simply on bilateral issues and not simply on regional issues, but global issues. India and the United States are going to be two of the half dozen or so countries that are going to have the biggest impact on how the 21st century is going to unfold, whether in terms of the global economy or global energy issues or global climate issues or global strategic issues. And so this is a relationship with tremendous potential importance. And the real question is whether people on both sides essentially translate that potential into reality. And what we're going to try to do is do our small part.
Jamshid, do you want to have any last thoughts?
No, I entirely agree with the sentiment expressed here, and I think that open debate and discussion like we've had today really build that understanding to a large extent.
Yeah, I think the whole trick is to recognize and identify the potential of maximizing cooperation that exists, and identify also the hurdles which are in the way. And I think the biggest one is what is generally referred to as trust deficit. It's the open discussion and dialogue and free press on both sides which can reduce that trust deficit, because that is in our hands. To a certain extent, the element of trust comes in as a factor in any bilateral relationship. But what we have to see is whether it is based on misunderstanding or actual substance.
I think the emphasis today on Pakistan and the nature of the potential changes in the US-Pakistan relationship of what happened last Sunday night, Monday morning is clearly central. And I think even in a long-term sense as well, if you look back at the last 60 years, we had very few quarrels with the United States. Our interests did not clash directly. That our problem was what the US was doing in our region affected our interests. The nature of the US relationship with Pakistan, the arms supply relationship, which created problems for India, and that was the main grouse. I mean, then we got into the nuclear thing. Otherwise, there was no direct clash of interests. Similarly, Americans had problems, not with our own bilateral relationship, but with what we were doing with the Soviet Union. So it's in the last 20 years that we've seen a transformation, an expansion of a bilateral relationship. That, in fact, the trade today, US trade has reached $60 billion. We're talking about issues today and a range of issues that we never did before. So the bilateral relationship is advancing. But whether it will make significant dramatic breakthroughs could, might, would depend upon what happens in Pakistan, Afghanistan, because that's a primary concern for the United States today in the US political debate. And it's also a principal security threat to us. So how we organize the space in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the next 2 to 3 years, can we work together in changing that dynamic in that region? And as China rises, how do India and the United States work together in broader Asia? These are the big issues, and these are not the only issues. They're also the issues of global governance, which because of our size, today India is a factor in the debate on global warming and mitigation of the carbon emissions. And the more important fact, I think, is that today we are engaged with each other in the context of India's own rise. We talked about China's rise. India is also rising. That until now, India had to adapt to what the Americans were doing with the Russians and the Pakistanis or someone else. But the rise of India today, India gives India the capabilities to alter, to complicate, I hope occasionally wreck, the other people's calculations. Or potentially choose the winners who might come out in potential conflicts that might take place in our neighborhood. So that's a very different position that India is in today. And I think it is that must inform, I think, the way we debate with the Americans, the way we debate the issues within ourselves, because India's own ability to influence outcomes in its neighborhood has changed. And I think one of the things that hopefully this project would do is, in this changing context where there is a fundamental redistribution of power in the international system in favor of both China and India, in that context, how do our national interests meet? How do we try to harmonize the nature of our interests in our region, both sides, to the east and the west? Both the regions are in great turmoil, and at the international level. So I think we've had an excellent beginning, I think, today, that this project kicks off. So on behalf of the Aspen Institute India, let me thank you all for coming this evening and participating in this event and making it a success. But before you leave, do give a hand to the 4 panelists we have.